Hey there, has this ever happened to you? Oh boy, I just passed the JLPT N5. I guess it's time to do some immersion and read native material. I heard this Albatross Kukairoku VN is really good apparently. Let's give it a shot. Well, fear not, because Uncle Miran is here to help you rise up from your decanized status. Jokes aside, in this video I will give you 10 recommendations that are easy to read in Japanese while also being quite good. And don't worry, Hanahira is not one of them. So let's not waste any more time and get down to it. Number 1. Starting with Aonatsu Line. If I'm being honest, most Moog are considerably simple to read. But at the very least, I wanted to recommend something that goes for a more ambitious narrative approach. This is the story of a group of friends who want to live to the fullest their last summer vacation before having to start thinking about university and their impending adulthood. I know it's not the most original of premises, but Aonatsu Line particularly shines in one of its 3 routes, where the plot offers an intriguing narrative angle on the childhood friend trope. Obviously, the Japanese generally used in this VN isn't that complex, otherwise I wouldn't have included it. It has a very grounded feeling, focusing primarily on the slice of life aspect. The dynamics of the group work well enough to not make it boring. The presentation is also superb and very refined. Probably the hardest aspect of this VN, if you can even call it that, is that Yui, one of the main girls, really likes to use proverbs and other old sayings. But you can also take that as a chance to learn new expressions, even if you are never going to use them in real life. Number 2. You probably don't need me to tell you what canon is, but just in case, this is the game that put key on the map and established the Nakige genre as a cornerstone of the medium, basically becoming the blueprint of what visual novels would follow for the coming years. It's a winter story where the protagonist Yuichi moves to his aunt's house, where his cousin and childhood friend Nayuki also lives. Yuichi is having a hard time remembering the details of the last time he visited this place years ago. But as he spends more time in this town, those memories will gradually resurface one by one. If I'm being honest, most of Key's major titles are relatively easy to read, but what makes canon a perfect candidate for Japanese learners is that it's not absurdly long, and it also doesn't have any major spikes in difficulty like Air does. There's perhaps Mai's route, which at times gets a bit esoteric and slightly hard to follow for beginners, but even then, it's not exactly challenging. Outside of that, the game's conversations are very quippy and use simple grammar. So it also has the plus that the humor is very understandable and doesn't require you to know slang words or anything complex to follow it. Number 3. This is one VN that I recently reviewed, so if you want my in-depth thoughts about it, you can check out the video I made. At any rate, Moshimo Ashita Giyahari Naraba is a story about a high schooler whose girlfriend unexpectedly passes away due to a sudden illness. He's left in a state of shock, unable to process this loss. That is until one day when his loved one appears in front of him, but this time as a ghost. Despite this thematic, the plot is quite lighthearted, with plenty of comedy and feel-good scenes. At the same time, it also includes emotional moments to make things more engaging. The game also excels in its presentation, both in the visual and audio departments. As far as the Japanese being used, I got the impression it was very basic, making the story easily understandable for newcomers. It might also be a good opportunity to get accustomed to Kansai dialect, since one of the main characters speaks it. Her accent wasn't too strong, simply using typical expressions such as okini or kanninya. I think it's interesting to get in touch with this way of speaking, since they use a rich intonation that sounds quite different from what most people studying Japanese are used to. Number 4. Unlike other games in this list, Tokeiji Kake no Leyline is a visual novel with a strong emphasis on its plot. It's somewhat unusual for a story-driven VN to be this easy to read, but the Japanese used in this game is surprisingly simple. The story follows a young man who, after enrolling in a mysterious boarding school, finds himself working at a bureau tasked with handling paranormal incidents occurring at the school grounds. This is a narrative that blends magic elements with a nice dose of mystery. the game itself is actually a trilogy that forms a grand overarching narrative. But each installment also has its own self-contained stories and endings. If you want to play this untranslated, however, make sure you buy either the Japanese version at DL site or Fonsa, instead of the one being sold on Steam, since that one doesn't have Japanese text. There's also the option of getting the Switch version, which also includes some extra scenarios. Either way, I can recommend this one if you want to dive into a more ambitious, plot-focused experience. Number 5.
5分後に意外な結末、モノクロームの図書館。
To be honest, I considered not including this one, since in my opinion, it's just an okay visual novel. However, I believe its premise is so well suited for beginners that I felt it deserved a spot in this list. It's essentially a collection of very short stories, loosely connected by a non-intrusive meta-narrative. The main gist is that these stories can be finished in about 5 minutes, and they all have some kind of unexpected twist. As with any anthology VNs, the quality of these stories varies, but even if you get a mediocre one, at least it will be over rather quickly. It also has a neat feature where, after finishing a story, the game asks you to pick and share which emotion it evoked, gradually coloring your collection based on your responses. The main caveat it might have regarding its difficulty is that it's not voiced, but aside from that, the language used was quite simple. As I mentioned, it's not amazing by any means, but it might be a solid choice if you are looking to start reading something that's not overly anime-like. Number 6.
ユニバルからの丸があるストライク。
Out of all the developers I've played visual novels from, I believe that Apricot is one of the most underrated. Their games are not that well known, but are in general really enjoyable and well-presented VNs. I've been thinking about dedicating one video to them, but for the time being, I will recommend you checking out Unibaru if you want something that's both easy but also fun and engaging. The story is about a dorm whose tenants are girls who possess supernatural powers. The protagonist, who's currently working as the landlord of the dorm, is trying his best to keep their existence a secret from certain up-to-no-good agencies. But the girls, with their completely carefree attitude and constant infighting, are making his life nearly impossible. There are multiple reasons as to why I think this game is great for learners. On one hand, the text consists exclusively of dialogue, something that's rare for visual novels with action scenes. The structure of the story also helps, since chapters are very well defined and don't drag on for too long. I think that if its dumb style of comedy aligns with your sense of humor, you will probably get a kick out this one. Number 7.
下級生。
I thought it would be a good idea to include here older games too. The first one being Elf's classic dating sim, Kakyusei. Well, technically you could call it a Nanpa sim, since your goal isn't to date the girl, but to seduce them. Semantics aside, this game belongs to the series that started back in 1992 with Uguuu. Kakyusei, however, adhered more closely to the current trend of the time set by games like Tokamemo, which basically meant a shift to a slightly younger cast instead of having all sorts of heroines. Obviously, this has its detractors, but this approach allowed for a stronger sense of cohesion within the cast, as well as exploring better developed relationships. Surprisingly enough, this series is very easy to read in its original language. The text is mainly made up of simple dialogue, and the interactions are brief and easy to understand. Probably what's not so easy to understand are the game's systems, in particular succeeding at finishing any girl's storyline. But there are plenty of guides out there to help you out. Definitely check this one out if you are also into visual novel history. Number 8.
雫。
Another classic VN that I thought would make a good introduction to untranslated VNs is Leaf's Shizuku, the original Denpa visual novel. If you don't know what Denpa is, it's basically a subgenre of horror that mixes both supernatural elements as well as psychological themes. The story of this one is about a high school student who is sent to investigate the school at night after an odd rumor began to spread out, claiming that some students were meeting there after dark. Despite what one would think, considering that Denpa visual novels have the reputation of being rather obtuse, the Japanese used here is really not that hard. Plus, it also helps that the VN itself is relatively short. I think this is an easy recommendation if you want to read something that's a bit out of the ordinary. Number 9.
トロピカルキス
This one is actually the first visual novel I reviewed on this channel, mainly for the reason that I wanted more people to check it out. It's a very pleasant read that strikes a good balance between humor and romance. The premise of the story is that the protagonist finds himself a job at a newly constructed summer resort. The only issue is that all of his work colleagues there are girls with whom he has had unrequited love feelings in the past. It turns out those were all misunderstandings on his behalf, and now all the girls are trying to compete to gain his love once and for all. It's a very self-indulgent type of narrative, but the fun group chemistry makes it deeply entertaining. The reason I'm recommending it for Japanese learning beginners is that, besides the easy language, I thought it was really well paced. One of the problems when reading your first untranslated piece of media is that you will inevitably spend far more time with it than usual. But thanks to this brisk pacing, I don't think this one will be a sluggish experience. Number 10.
甘神
Amagami is basically my go-to recommendation for Japanese beginners. Not only is it very easy to read, but it's also very good. Honestly, the hardest part might be getting used to the game's systems, but once you get the hang of it, they become second nature. As for the game itself, it's a dating sim, but unlike Kakyusei, Amagami is really straightforward and newbie-friendly. What makes Amagami great is without a doubt its cast. Every single one of the main girls is absurdly likable, having unique personalities that don't strictly adhere to anime tropes, but feel instead very relatable and authentic. The game, of course, uses reasonably basic Japanese, consisting mostly of dialogue and inner thoughts, which shouldn't pose too much of a challenge. It also has the advantage that, outside of the protagonist's lines, it is fully voice acted. This is really one game I cannot recommend strong enough. The only issue is that once you've finished it, there's this mysterious thing that occurs where your bank account will suddenly deplete due to all the dakimakuras of the girls that you will have unconsciously bought without realizing it. Very strange. And those are basically it. Needless to say, even if I consider them quite easy, that doesn't mean that you can just jump into them without some basic grammar knowledge and at least a decent amount of vocabulary learned. But if you are currently studying N3 level Japanese, I think these will be perfect for you. If you are at a lower level, you can probably also give them a shot, although in that case, I would recommend perhaps using text hooker software to make the reading smoother. Still, the earlier you start reading native material, the better, so don't be afraid to venture into this type of challenge. Anyway, if you made it this far, you're awesome. Thanks for watching. Mirren out.